You wake up one morning and realize you no longer want anything, not because you've become enlightened, not because you've risen above desire, but because nothing pulls you anymore. The dreams, the ambition, the goals, all of it feels like someone else's story. There's no crisis, no drama, just this low, persistent silence. You're not sad, but not joyful either. Not lost, but not exactly present. You're there going through motions, but some part of you isn't playing along. And if you're honest, that scares you more than any breakdown ever could. Because this isn't falling apart. This is watching life fade into grayscale. This is the hollow after the fire where nothing has burned down, yet nothing is standing. You thought awakening would feel like rising, but instead, it feels like floating, like you've stepped out of a game you no longer believe in, and now you're standing there, holding pieces that no longer fit. Carl Jung understood this. He wrote, "Enlightenment doesn't come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." What no one tells you is that awakening doesn't immediately light you up sometimes. It dims everything first. It dismantles the map, the compass, and the traveler all at once. And maybe, just maybe, that emptiness isn't the end of something. It's the space where something real can finally begin. For most of your life, motivation had a direction. It pointed somewhere toward a goal, a title, a dream version of yourself. You moved because there was something to chase, and behind every action there was an idea of who you were supposed to become. It didn't always feel noble, but it felt necessary. You worked, you tried, you climbed not just for success, but to fulfill a sense of self the world had handed you piece by piece. Then came the awakening. And with it, the gentle, or maybe violent, unraveling of everything you thought was you. At first, it felt like freedom, a lightness. You saw through the game, and for a moment it was exhilarating. The masks fell, the illusions cracked. You realized you had been chasing things that never belonged to you. It was liberating, for a while. But what no one tells you is that clarity has a cost. Because once the old rules stop making sense, the structures built on them begin to collapse. What falls is not just your job or your relationship or your plans. What falls is you. Carl Jung called it the dissolution of the persona, the mask we wear to function in society. It's not a lie, but it's not the whole truth either. The persona is how you perform being someone. And when it falls, what's left isn't a better version of you. What's left is silence. What's left is the space between versions where nothing feels solid and nothing pulls you forward. The goals that used to energize you now feel hollow. The affirmations that once kept you afloat sound empty. And the vision board that made sense a year ago, you barely recognize it. But that doesn't mean you're broken. It means your motivation system, the internal engine built by identity, has stopped responding to the old fuel. This is where many people panic. They confuse this stillness with apathy. They try to restart the old engine to reattach to the old goals. But something in you already knows that system won't start again. Not because it failed, but because it has fulfilled its role. Jung didn't see this as a setback. He saw it as the beginning of individuation, the slow, painful, necessary withdrawal from the false self so that something real can take its place. But the in-between, it's not glamorous, it's not Instagrammable, it's quiet, dull, empty, and brutally honest. You don't feel called to anything, not because you've lost your spark, but because the spark you once lived by wasn't yours to begin with. It was borrowed from culture, from family, from fear. Now, with the stage empty and the script in ashes, the psyche waits. It does not rush to rebuild. It allows you to sit in the wreckage and feel the full weight of everything you're no longer pretending to be. This isn't the end of you. It's the end of the performance. And if it feels like you've stopped moving, maybe that's not failure. Maybe it's grace. Maybe you're exactly where transformation begins, not with another goal, but with the loss of who you thought you had to be. And that mirror doesn't reflect achievement or clarity. It reflects your absence so that something deeper can emerge. You didn't lose yourself. You lost the idea of yourself. And that's not failure. That's the invitation. There's a moment after the collapse, quiet, heavy, hard to explain, when nothing makes sense anymore. Not in a chaotic way, in an eerily still way. It's the absence of urgency, the absence of direction, the absence of wanting. You wake up and there's no fire, no craving, no pull. You go through the motions, making coffee, answering messages, showing up where you're supposed to be, but your soul is somewhere else. Not asleep, not depressed, just waiting. This space is terrifying because it doesn't scream. It whispers, and what it whispers is not dramatic, it's subtle, almost invisible. Why bother? Not from despair, but from a kind of radical indifference. You're not against the world, you just don't feel part of it anymore. Carl Jung warned us about this. He described it not as a breakdown, but as a psychic pause, a necessary retreat of energy into the unconscious, a pulling back of the libido, not sexual energy, but the life force that gives meaning and movement to your being. When you awaken, when the false identity dissolves, the psyche doesn't immediately fill the gap. Instead, it empties. It withdraws its projections. It pauses. And in this pause, the old sources of motivation, ambition, achievement, approval lose their grip. The mind doesn't know what to do, but the soul is quiet. Not because it has nothing to say, but because it's listening for something deeper than words. This is what Jung called enantiodromia, the principle that everything, pushed to its extreme, turns into its opposite. Where once you were driven, you are now still. Where once you craved recognition, now you crave nothing. It feels like regression, but it's not. It's compensation, rebalancing. Most people don't recognize this for what it is. In a hyperproductive world, this stillness gets labeled as laziness, as failure. You're taught that if you're not climbing, you're falling. So you judge yourself. You try to force yourself back into motion. But the very act of forcing is a betrayal of what your psyche is trying to do: rest, digest, reconfigure. You see, the psyche is wise. It knows when to move and when to stop. And after an awakening, a real one, it stops. Not to punish you, but to preserve you, because you've just seen through everything. The chase, the mask, the story, and what comes next can't be rushed. Jung compared this stage to alchemy, the negrito, the blackening, the death of form, the decomposition, not because something went wrong, but because something is being prepared. Without this stage, there can be no transformation, no gold, no rebirth. And yet we resist it. We panic in the quiet. We reach for answers, for plans, for the next step. But sometimes the next step is not moving at all. Sometimes the most radical act is to stay, to feel, to wait, without demanding clarity. Because it's in this stillness that something ancient begins to stir, not the old fire, but a new one. Not the motivation of ego, but the longing of the soul. It doesn't arrive as a lightning bolt. It arrives as a whisper, a nudge, a pull towards something you don't yet understand. But first, the void. This void is not empty, it's spacious. It holds everything that's ever been suppressed: the grief, the longing, the forgotten parts of you. They rise not to hurt you, but to be witnessed, to be felt, to be reclaimed. And until you allow that emptiness to speak, nothing real can emerge. You cannot rebuild a house while pretending the old one never burned down. So if you find yourself staring at the ceiling, unable to move, unable to care, you're not failing. You're being paused on purpose. Because what's coming next isn't a return to what was. It's the slow emergence of what always was, now ready to be lived. There's something that arrives quietly once the world inside you has gone still. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. Until one day, in the middle of a calm morning or a sleepless night, it steps forward, not as fear but as something strangely familiar, like a face you haven't seen in decades. It's the parts of you you've long since buried, the grief that never had permission, the anger that was too loud for the house you grew up in, the wildness you tucked away to be accepted, the longing you numbed so you could function. They don't return with violence. They return with weight, a heaviness that doesn't shout but lingers. Carl Jung called this the return of the shadow. Not the dark side, not the villain inside you, but the repressed, the neglected, the hidden. The aspects of your being that were pushed into the unconscious because they didn't fit the story you were told to live. During awakening, real awakening, the collapse of identity clears the stage for them to emerge. The noise is gone. The distractions are gone. And now, with no persona to maintain, the shadow rises. Not to destroy you, but to integrate with you. Not to drag you backward, but to return you to something more whole. It shows up in strange ways. A sudden wave of sadness for no reason. A dream that shakes you. An irrational fear that makes no sense, until you trace it back to a childhood memory you forgot you remembered. It shows up in a tight chest, in words that tremble before being spoken, in the silence after a question you can't answer. Most people mistake this for relapse. They believe something is going wrong, but Jung understood this is not failure. This is the unconscious becoming conscious. And the discomfort, it's not dysfunction, it's revelation. You might try to avoid it. You might try to rise above it, flood yourself with positive thinking, reframe everything, declare it's all part of the plan. But Jung warned against that too. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he said, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the heart of the work. Not resisting the parts of you that hurt, but sitting with them long enough to hear what they've been trying to say for years. It takes patience. It takes presence. It takes a kind of strength that doesn't look like strength at all, the kind that stays soft when everything inside wants to shut down. But something happens when you stop resisting. You start to feel again. Not the frantic highs of false excitement, but the quiet truth underneath everything. You begin to recognize yourself in the places you used to hide from. You begin to forgive yourself, not because you should, but because you finally understand. This isn't about healing to become someone new. It's about finally becoming who you were before you forgot. The shadow doesn't come to haunt you. It comes to return the pieces you left behind. And in their presence, something shifts. You begin to take up space again. Not because you're performing, but because you're whole. At some point, the silence begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but you notice something, a thought that doesn't feel forced, a small curiosity, a desire not to perform or to achieve, but to move, to create, to speak, gently, honestly. It's not the old drive returning, it's something else, something quieter, deeper, older. This is the beginning of what Carl Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the shadow, of reclaiming what's been split off. And as this inner work deepens, something begins to stir beneath the surface. Not the persona, not the mask, but the self. Jung didn't describe the self as an ideal version of you. He saw it as the center, the unchanging core beneath all the roles, all the conditioning. The self doesn't chase. It doesn't prove. It expresses. It witnesses. It moves not in reaction to the world, but in alignment with what is true. And when the self begins to emerge, it doesn't shout. It nudges. It rearranges your relationship with time, with effort, with desire. You no longer ask, "What should I do?" Instead, you begin to ask, "What feels honest?" The goals that once excited you now feel hollow. But something else, something gentler, begins to call your name. It might be a walk you suddenly feel pulled to take, a sentence you feel ready to write, a truth you can finally say out loud. This is what Jung called living symbolically, when your outer life begins to reflect the movements of your inner world. When you stop organizing your day by obligation and start listening for resonance. When you stop striving for identity and begin responding to what life is asking of you. You're not chasing anymore. You're aligning. You say no more easily now, not out of resistance but clarity. You say yes more slowly, not out of fear but discernment. You rest without guilt. You create without needing applause. You choose presence over performance. And it doesn't look impressive, it looks ordinary. Quiet mornings, honest conversations, unpublished poems, long pauses, gentle boundaries. But in the ordinary there is something sacred. Something that finally makes sense not to the world but to you. You begin to trust the subtler signs, the dreams, the gut feelings, the synchronicities that don't demand logic but feel like home. You stop needing certainty. You start responding to meaning. You live not from the surface but from the center. This is not the motivation of adrenaline. It's the movement of alignment. It's not fast but it's real. It doesn't burn out because it burns from within. And maybe this is what awakening was always meant to reveal. Not a better version of the old self, but the quiet return of the one who was always waiting beneath. You're not going back. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't. The person you were before awakening doesn't exist anymore. The goals they chased, the image they wore, the life they fought to build, they've dissolved. Not because they were wrong, but because they were borrowed. And now here you are, not broken, not finished, but in between. The map is gone, the fire has changed. The silence is still echoing, but something's different. There's no panic in the stillness anymore. No need to escape it. You're starting to understand, this isn't the absence of life, it's the presence of something else. Something slower, truer. Something that doesn't shout but never leaves. Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he never said it would be quick, or pretty, or easy to explain. Becoming isn't a moment, it's a descent, a pause, a silence, a remembering. And maybe the reason you feel like you've lost your spark is because the old fire had to die so you could find a flame that doesn't flicker in the wind. This isn't a setback, it's a threshold. You're not less motivated, you're more honest. You no longer need to chase what was never yours. You only need to stay close to what's real, to what resonates quietly, to what feels like home inside your chest, to what keeps whispering, even when you're too tired to answer. If you're here in this pause, in this softness, in this sacred undoing, then you haven't failed. You've arrived.